Hey guys, so there appears to be quite the community of mental health deniers on YouTube. Now, I've already discussed a couple of them before. The problem seems to be more pervasive than I thought it was. It's not just these big YouTubers, saying some ignorant things about mental illness. Like, if you look up mental illness doesn't exist, there's a whole collection of videos. So today I'm going to be looking at a video by Stefan Molyneux. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Again, some of you guys might like him because I know he's this popular right-wing, or I'm not sure exactly what his political views are, but he's a popular political commentator. But today we're going to look at a video. It's an old video of his called "There Is No Such Thing as Mental Illness." So let's get into the video.
Hi everybody, my name is Stefan Molyneux, and I'm the host of Free Domain Radio, which is the largest and most popular philosophy show in the world. This is a presentation entitled, There Is No Such Thing as Mental Illness. And please, before we start, understand that I'm not trying to imply or state that depression and anxiety and other forms of discomfort and agony are not very real, very palpable, and sometimes debilitating. The experts that I cite here are going to argue that it does not fall into the category of illness, which is very, very important.
So he's saying conditions like depression and anxiety exist, but they're not illness. I don't understand. Is he, again, like Paul Joseph Watson, arguing that it's just a product of society? I mean, I haven't watched the whole video. I'll have to look into it. But I'm not exactly sure what his stance is right now. I guess we'll find out.
So what is the theory around mental illness? Well, the idea is that there are billions of people around the world who suffer from this thing called mental illness, or a disease of the mind. 26% of Americans suffer from mental illness. And according to the National Institute of Mental Health study in 2010, almost 60 million Americans are going to suffer from an episode of mental illness in any given year. Now, the general theory is presented that mental illness is a disease or a deficiency that is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain that is corrected by psychiatric drugs.
Right there, there's a fault in his reasoning. He says that mental illness is only corrected by psychiatric drugs. That is not the entire picture. I don't think there's any therapist or psychiatrist who will say you just need drugs and that will cure you. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of pill pushers kind of doctors who try to prescribe you medications that you might not necessarily need, but therapy is always important in helping mental illness. If there's a doctor who does not refer you to a therapist after you've been diagnosed with a mental illness, then you should probably sue that doctor, because really medication is not the end-all be-all. And maybe it was at one point. I'm not exactly sure on the history, but it's not. We've gone far from just prescribing people medication. Therapy is an utmost concern when it comes to treating mental illness. Medication is only part of that treatment plan. And I've never been to a doctor who did not also prescribe therapy in addition to medication. Now, again, that may have been true at some point where, they just didn't know as much about mental illness, but that's not the case now, at least from my experience. Also, but psychiatrists can accurately diagnose mental illness and find effective treatments for it. Psychiatrists aren't perfect with diagnosis. I've been misdiagnosed before, especially if you are having an acute episode of mental illness and you go to a hospital. It's actually really difficult for someone to determine what you have, when you're in the emergency room or when you're in the hospital, because it's such an acute episode of mental illness. So he already has a few misconceptions about it, and I think I know where he's going with this. He's going to say, oh, they're just doing it to sell drugs. which is not the case. Mental illness is not fabricated to sell drugs. The pharmaceutical industry that deals with psychiatric drugs would not exist without mental illness. Just the idea that they've fabricated mental illness in order to sell drugs is kind of absurd. I mean, again, there are pill pusher doctors for sure. There is definitely a motive by the pharmaceutical industry to sell you drugs, but it's not. That doesn't mean that mental illness is entirely fabricated. And, it's kind of this conspiracy theory at this point. I think Paul Joseph Watson was going with the same thing, that we just are not good with society, and we call that mental illness so that people can pay for drugs. That's not how it works. There's actual evidence, which I will link in the description, that mental illness is tied to chemical imbalances in the brain. Of course, there are also environmental factors. Of course, there's always a psychological aspect to it. But that's the reason why psychologists call it the biopsychosocial approach, meaning that there's a variety of factors that go into mental illness. Part of that is biology. Sorry, this was a really long-winded rant, but I think I needed to get that out there.
Zoloft and Prozac and Xanax and so on. The idea is put forward that psychiatrists can accurately diagnose mental illness and have safe and effective treatments for it. And thus psychiatry is considered a valid medical specialty like cardiology and so on, and the claims of the movement are based on scientific research. That is the theory that is put forward. And what is the scale of this? Well, we touched on this in the previous slide. The scale is enormous. Global sales of antidepressants and stimulants, anti-anxiety and antipsychotic drugs reached more than $76 billion a year. That is more than double the annual US government budget that is spent on the so-called war on drugs. Internationally, 54 million people are taking antidepressants, which are known to cause addiction, violence, and homicidal behavior.
Let's analyze that. So he says that the main takeaway he gets from this is that we're selling drugs for mental illness, and it's a huge industry, and that is true. There is quite a market for drugs to treat mental health problems. But then he goes to taking antidepressants, which are known to cause suicidal and homicidal behavior. First of all, a lot of people try to link, when you hear of a school shooter or another violent person, they try to say, oh, they were taking antidepressants, so therefore it must have caused the behavior. Just because there's a correlation there doesn't mean there's a cause. So I would really like to see this homicidal behavior claim, because there's just not a lot of evidence that it causes that kind of behavior. And furthermore, even if it did, that's an extremely rare complication. I think with antidepressants, they are known to cause suicidal thoughts, at least most of them anyway, but homicidal behavior is not really a listed side effect of antidepressants. Most of the evidence for that comes from people taking, again, people like school shooters and saying, oh, they were on antidepressants must have caused the violence.
Last year, this is 2011, last year 1 in 4 women were taking mental health meds last year.
Okay, so another 1 in 4 women statistic. It's funny because you always see the 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 3, 1 in 1, whatever statistics from SJWs. And again, I don't want to get too much into politics, but I feel like he's using the same technique. 1 in 4 women this, 1 in 4 women that. Let's care about the women's. When really those statistics are usually overblown. I mean, it is believable for me that 1 in 4 people are taking mental health medications if 1 in 4 people have a mental illness. I just want to see his sources on this, because it feels to me like he's appealing to people who would think, oh, the poor women's taking the mental health meds, just like SJWs are like, oh, the poor women's getting domestically abused and raped. 1 in 4, 1 in 4. It's it doesn't seem like he has the right motives for me to believe that statistic entirely, even though I do want to believe it. I do want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But anyway, let's continue.
20% of all Americans, that's 15% of men. 20 million school children worldwide have now been diagnosed with these mental disorders and prescribed cocaine-like stimulants and powerful antidepressants as treatment.
Okay. So he's saying that Ritalin, essentially, I think that's what he's referring to, Ritalin or Ritalin-like substances, are like cocaine. Yes, they are stimulants. Yes, they are amphetamines. And so, yes, potentially they can be addictive. But to compare it to the same thing as cocaine is just two entirely different. Like, let's compare it like comparing caffeine to cocaine. They're in similar stimulant categories, but they're completely different drugs with completely different side effects. And I'm not saying, again, that Ritalin is a good thing to take, and there's plenty of people who abuse it, but amphetamine stimulants are not the same thing as cocaine. It's just, they're not. So, again, I will cite my sources, which, let me check the description here. He has one link, fdrurl.com/mental illness. That's his only source, so I find that interesting.
Psychiatric drug use and abuse is surging worldwide. More than 100 million prescriptions for antidepressants alone were written in 2002 at a cost of $19.5 billion.
I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he's right on that. I don't understand how people writing prescriptions for antidepressants relates to drug abuse. He says use and abuse, but he doesn't really cite that people are abusing these drugs. He just cites that people are getting prescriptions for these drugs, even though they could be taking them entirely as intended. Sorry, I have a lot to say on this. This is going to be a long video.
1 in 7 prescriptions in France, for instance, includes a psychotropic drug, and more than 50% of the unemployed, almost 2 million people, take psychotropic drugs. Combined spending on antipsychotic drugs and antidepressants jumped from around $500 million in 1986 to nearly $20 billion in 2004. The scope is huge. Driven by DSM. A DSM is the diagnostic manual for psychiatrists. Started off with just a few dozen, and now there are hundreds and hundreds of diagnoses of these mental illnesses.
That's only because we're becoming better at understanding mental illness. That's why there are more diagnoses. You know, when they first wrote the DSM, they were like, oh, you feel depressed, that's one category. Oh, you feel anxious, that's another category. Oh, you're psychotic, that's another category. There wasn't really specifically lined out disorders, or at least not in the way that we understand them today. Also, it's important to note that homosexuality used to be considered a mental disorder in the DSM. So the fact that he's saying, like, oh, there were only a few disorders at the time, like that means something. Like, no, we just did not understand mental illness in the same way. And I'm not saying that the DSM is perfect. I've read through it several times, and it's got some things in there that I don't think should be in there, and it's got some things that I think it's missing. But that's obviously my opinion. I'm not an expert, so I can't evaluate it in the way that an expert would. But again, the DSM's not perfect. It's just how we understand mental illness. And also there's the ICD-10, which is the International Classification of Diseases, 10th edition. And that's what's more commonly used in Europe as opposed to the US. So I would recommend taking a look at that as well and seeing that as another perspective on mental illness. Because even though the ICD-10 and the DSM line up a lot, they do have their differences.
So, driven by DSM-derived mental illness statistics, the international mental health budget has skyrocketed over the past 10 years. So, in 1994, in the US, the mental health budget was $33 billion. In 1994, more than $80 billion today.
Okay, he keeps citing these statistics that are like, oh, the mental health budget has gone way up. But he goes from 1994 and 1986 to 2004, and I don't think he's counting for inflation then. Like, of course they're going to spend more because everything costs more. And again, we are getting better at understanding mental illness, so more people are getting diagnosed. We just have a better understanding of it, but he's not taking that into account.
Switzerland's spending on mental health has increased from a little over $70 million in 1988 to $184 million over a 10-year period. And these are all adjusted for inflation.
My bad. I'm going to inspect his source later on, but he does adjust for inflation, so my bad.
Germany currently spends more than $2.5 billion per year on mental health. France, the mental health costs have soared, adding $400 million to the country's deficit. Let's look at the growth of these medications. So, if you have a medication that claims to cure malaria, and you have a population which is significantly infected by malaria, and you have a cure, then as you apply the cure, you should expect the cases of malaria to go down. That's one of the ways you know in which a medication is efficacious. You have a disease and you have a cure. As you apply the cure, the disease incidence should shrink, should diminish.
Okay, there's a bit of fault in that reasoning when it comes to mental health. First of all, no medication or therapy is supposed to cure mental health. Mental health has never claimed to have any cures. It just claims to have treatment. And then he talks about the incidence of a disease. I'm not sure if he's referring to the total people who have the disease once the medication is administered, or to the cases that come up in the first place. Because there's a big difference in saying, say, depression. If you have, I'm just going to say 10% of a population is depressed. The way depression, you can't really prevent depression with medication. And maybe sometime in the future there will be a way to prevent it. But that 10% is still going to show up even if you are able to cure it. I mean, by the 10% that are coming to your office looking for a cure because you haven't prevented it in the first place. And you could say the same thing for any other disease, that whatever percentage of the population is still going to get it even if they're later cured.
So it should have declined. The per capita incidence of mental illness should have declined over the past 50 years since the introduction of the first mental health meds. So let's look. In 1955, there were 355,000 adults in state and county mental hospitals with a psychiatric diagnosis. During the next 3 decades, which was the era of the first generation of psychiatric drugs, the number of disabled mentally ill rose from 355,000 to 1.25 million. Prozac arrived on the market in 1988, and during the next 20 years, the number of disabled mentally ill grew to more than 4 million adults in 2007. The prescribing of psychiatric medications to children and adolescents just exploded during this period, 1987 to 2007. And as this medical practice took hold, the number of youth in America receiving a government disability check because of a mental illness leapt from 16,200 in 1987 to 561,569 in 2007. A 35-fold increase. Let's look at some more growth. If we go back even further, at the turn of the last century, 1903, about 1 in 500 people was hospitalized for mental illness. From 1955 to 1987, the antipsychotic drugs Thorazine and Haldon and the tricyclic antidepressants such as Elavil and Enafranil, the number of disabled mentally ill increased fourfold to 1 out of every 75 persons. Now, 1 in every 50 Americans is disabled by mental illness. The number of mentally disabled people in the US has been increasing at the rate of 150,000 people per year since 1987. That's an increase every day over the past 17 years of 410 people per day newly disabled by mental illness.
So, again, going back to my previous point, just because there's an increase in mentally ill people doesn't mean that the drugs are causing it or that there's some conspiracy theory to overdiagnose mental illness. It's like the people who claim that autism is an epidemic because the rate of autistic people has been increasing. No, we're just getting better at diagnosing it. And the definition of autism has expanded to fit a wider range of people. It's the same thing with mental illness. We're getting better at diagnosing and identifying mental illness. More people are coming for help. So, again, to make this claim that mental illness doesn't exist because there's this increasing rate of mentally ill people and you're connecting that to the pharmaceutical industry, it just doesn't make sense.
The drugs appear to be exacerbating the supposed illness. There's a reason for that, which we'll get into. There is an escalation to the application of the psychotropic meds. So these are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, is the foundational component of these meds. So you have some sort of depression and you're given these drugs, and a certain percentage of people will suffer either a manic or psychotic attack, which is directly induced by the drug that they're taking.
Okay, this actually is true. Some people have a reaction to SSRIs because that's just the way their brain works. And it's funny how he lists a certain percentage. He doesn't list any of the exact statistics. But yes, some people are going to have a reaction. That's just what happens. That's like saying, oh, because some people have an allergic reaction to penicillin, that means that we shouldn't give everybody else who needs penicillin. It's just like an allergic reaction. Just because there is a certain number of people who have it doesn't mean that we should discontinue it entirely.
And so now they've gone from depression to depression plus mania or psychoses, and they go to the emergency room, and at which point they're shipped off to another psychiatrist who now gives them a diagnosis of bipolar, and they're given an antipsychotic to go along with the antidepressants. And at this point, they're moving down the path to chronic disability.
Several things there. First of all, I don't think he understands how bipolar disorder is treated. Antipsychotics can actually be used for a variety of conditions, not just psychosis. For example, they can also be used for OCD. It really depends on the medication. But typically, antipsychotics aren't given to people who are bipolar and don't show psychotic symptoms. If they just show manic symptoms, they're usually be given a mood stabilizer. And I know this from experience myself. So I don't think he quite understands what psychiatrists do in that situation. Also, if we know that some people will have an allergic reaction like this, don't you think that some psychiatrists, I mean, again, it might be hard to differentiate an actual manic episode that's just spontaneously generated from a manic episode due to medication, but it actually, in the DSM, it has an entire group of disorders due to medication. For every disorder, you have to rule out whether it's due to medication or not. So I think a psychiatrist would be good at noticing if somebody is having a reaction to medication as opposed to just a mental illness without medication. And I could be wrong again. There are plenty of psychiatrists who make misdiagnoses. But again, they would probably rule this out before.
Let's have a look at this growth. These are disability claims or recipients under the age of 65 diagnosed by mental illness from 87 to 2007. You can see they're just going way up and way up and way up. This is not a cure. Oh, the kids. From 1990 to 2010, as we mentioned, the number of disabled mentally ill children rose 35 times. Mental illness is now the leading cause of disability in children. 50% of the total kids on SSI rolls in 2007 were considered mentally ill, mentally disabled. In Massachusetts, 60 to 70% of kids in foster care are now on psychiatric drugs. Why? Do they have some genetic difference? No. They're in foster care. They're traumatized. Kids are often put on antidepressants or stimulants like Ritalin. Stimulants can cause mania. Stimulants can also cause psychosis, and this puts the kids on the escalating meds problem.
So his argument here is that kids, as well as adults, are misdiagnosed and mistreated, and that just further perpetuates the cycle. Again, I'm sure this can happen. There is plenty of abuse of diagnosis and treatment in mental health facilities. I've been through some of it myself. Generalizing that to all cases of people diagnosed with mental illness or treated for a mental illness is really inaccurate.
So, what is the fundamental issue that is occurring? Well, psychiatrists and psychiatric researchers have yet to conclusively prove that a single mental illness has a biological or physical cause or a genetic origin. They have been trying this for many, many years, and they have not come up with anything conclusive.
He's arguing that because you can't pinpoint a mental illness to just one biological or physical cause, it's not biologically or physically caused. When, first of all, we have classifications of disorders due to another medical condition. We have classifications of disorders due to medication. So already that's due to a medical cause. Like I said, there's an entire way of classifying disorders in the DSM due to another medication or due to a medical condition. Second of all, again, like I said, mental illnesses have biological, psychological, and social factors. That is a understood approach by psychologists. So that's taking in biological factors. Nobody ever says that, oh, this mental illness is definitively caused by this. There are usually several factors in causing mental illness. And by the way, I looked at his source, that one link that he offers, and it leads to a forum board that's clearly owned by him, but I can't, and I'm just reading that from the URL because I can't see the actual link. The link has expired or whatever problem is with it. So, I can't even check your source, you know? I don't know where he's getting all this information from other than what appears to be like a forum that he owns. So I'm going to end this video pretty soon. This will be a multi-part series. I'll try to get through his entire video. It's just quite a long-winded video and I have a lot to say about it.
And at this point, it doesn't matter. If they come up with something conclusive tomorrow, it still does not explain the last 50 years. Psychiatry has yet to develop a single physical test that can determine that whether or not an individual has a particular mental illness. There is not a single blood test or brain scan or MRI or anything like that which can determine whether anybody has a single or particular mental illness.
Well, it's a mental illness. What would you expect? A mental illness does not always have physical symptoms. Now, there are plenty of conditions that are in the DSM that do have physical symptoms. For example, narcolepsy. There is a physical test they can do to determine if somebody has narcolepsy. And I know that's considered more of a neurological than a psychological condition, but that is in the DSM. Same thing with sleep apnea. There are physical signs of sleep apnea. Furthermore, there are signs of mental illness as opposed to symptoms. For example, if somebody appears to be moving slowly or they appear to have tears in their eyes, those are considered signs of depression. Psychiatrists can note this. Yes, there is not any definitive test for it the way there is for physical illness, but there are physical signs that people can pick up on. I'm going to end this video here and continue on from the mark. It's at 9 minutes and 20 seconds. Sorry, this was quite the long-winded video, but this will likely be like a 3 or 4 part series. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.